a heinous murderer overshadow the life and legacy of my brother, Kenny Pohlman.
A handwritten blueprint for murder. A father telling his own daughter, "Wait in the car while I end two lives." This isn't a movie script, this is real, and it was the final night of Kelly Coppola's life. Blueprint pages scattered on a desk, a gunshot through a locked door, a mother's smile frozen forever in an old photo. Tonight, we pull back the curtain on one of Long Island's most disturbing murders. Before we begin, if you believe these stories should never be forgotten, subscribe right now, because this story deserves to live on. Kelly Coppola was more than just a name in a headline. She was a mother, a daughter, a friend. To those who knew her, she was the kind of person who gave warmth even in silence. She worked hard to rebuild her life after a marriage that had fractured beyond repair, and slowly, she was finding her way back to happiness. There were Friday nights with friends, long conversations about the future, and quiet moments of peace she thought she might never have again. Part of that peace came from someone new. His name was Kenneth Pohlman Jr. Kenneth wasn't flashy. He wasn't the kind of man who drew attention when he walked into a room. He worked a steady job, he kept to himself, and he carried a reputation for being dependable. For Kelly, that was enough. After years of chaos, Kenneth represented stability, a life free from storms. He was gentle, trustworthy, and he gave Kelly something her heart had been craving for years: calm. But peace, in one life, often stirs conflict in another. Behind the scenes, Kelly's ex-husband, Daniel Coppola, was simmering. Divorce is rarely clean, and theirs was no exception. There were arguments over money, resentment over decisions, and a custody battle that weighed heavily on both parents. Yet Daniel's anger didn't fade when the ink dried on the divorce papers. It deepened. What began as bitterness slowly became obsession. To friends, it looked like jealousy. To prosecutors, it looked like hatred with a plan. That plan was discovered in a place no one expected, inside Daniel's own home. During the investigation, police uncovered a document, a piece of paper that prosecutors would later describe as excruciatingly detailed. It wasn't a quick note scribbled down in a fit of rage. It wasn't a diary entry fueled by anger. It was something much colder. Typed, organized, calculated. A chilling document outlining not just thoughts, but steps, a sequence, a blueprint for murder. The very idea of it stopped even seasoned investigators in their tracks. Because what they were reading was not the heat of the moment, it was premeditation. A plan designed to leave Kelly Coppola and Kenneth Pohlman dead. A plan that listed names, not just Kelly and Kenneth, but attorneys tied to the divorce, even his own lawyer. It was the kind of discovery that turned a domestic case into something that looked like an execution. Think about that for a moment. While Kelly was moving forward with her life, smiling in photos, raising her daughter, and finding new love, someone else was sitting at a desk, typing words that would eventually translate into bullets. Every keystroke was a choice, every line a roadmap toward destruction, and hidden in those pages was the shadow of what would come next. This wasn't jealousy written in the heat of an argument. This wasn't a single night of rage. This was patience turned lethal. This was murder by design. Divorce is never just paperwork, it's scars written into daily life. For Kelly Coppola and her ex-husband Daniel, that truth became painfully clear. Their marriage had ended on paper, but in reality, the fight never stopped. There were arguments over bills, disputes over custody, and behind every conversation, the constant shadow of resentment. For their 15-year-old daughter, it meant growing up in a house that no longer felt like home, but like a battlefield. Kelly, though, refused to let bitterness be her legacy. She wanted stability for her child and peace for herself. Friends described her as a woman who was learning how to breathe again, someone who had been bent but not broken. She poured her energy into building a life beyond the divorce, a job that kept her secure, weekends that felt joyful again, and the courage to open her heart to love once more. With Kenneth by her side, she found the kind of comfort that wasn't loud or dramatic. but steady, the kind of love that promised safety. But safety for Kelly was danger for Daniel. Every moment she moved forward was, to him, a reminder that he was standing still. Each laugh, each photograph with Kenneth, each milestone celebrated without him became another cut to his pride. Divorce had taken away his marriage, but what he couldn't accept was the loss of control. And when control slips from the hands of a jealous man, it doesn't just vanish, it festers. The daughter lived between these two realities. With her mother, there was hope. With her father, there was heat, not of love, but of tension. She felt it in the silences that followed every exchange. She saw it in the anger that rose when Kenneth's name was mentioned. She didn't know it yet, but she was walking the fine line of two worlds colliding, and one night, she would be forced to play a role no child should ever play. Because in this story, the daughter wasn't just a bystander, she was part of the plan. On the night of August 28th, Daniel Coppola texted his teenage daughter. The message wasn't unusual on the surface, a father asking his child to come outside. But the timing, the insistence, the sharpness in his tone carried a weight she couldn't yet understand. He told her to wait in the car, and she did. She obeyed, unaware of what her obedience would cost. Picture yourself at 15. You trust your parents even when they fight. You believe that somehow both still want what's best for you. But what happens when one of them tells you to leave the house, to step away, to stay quiet, while your mother and her boyfriend are upstairs fast asleep? What happens when you realize that you've been positioned outside of the storm, not to protect you, but to keep you from stopping it? That is exactly where this young girl found herself. Sitting in her father's car, waiting, not knowing that each second brought her mother closer to death. For Daniel, she was no longer just his daughter. In that moment, she became part of the blueprint, a silent witness, carefully placed out of sight, while he prepared to walk into his ex-wife's home with a gun in his hand. The seeds of this tragedy had been planted long before that night. Seeds of jealousy, watered with anger, and fed by the belief that if he could not control Kelly's life, no one should. Divorce did not end Daniel's grip on the family. It simply transformed it, from arguments in a living room to a plan that would spill blood, from bitterness whispered under his breath to bullets that would echo through the quiet of a suburban street. Kelly was trying to build a future. Daniel was plotting to erase it. And caught between them was a teenage girl, too young to carry such a burden, yet too powerless to escape it. The night was coming when those two worlds, her mother's hope and her father's rage, would collide in the most violent way possible. If you turn away now, Kelly's voice fades. If you don't subscribe, her story is silenced by time. Don't let that happen. August 28th began like any other late summer evening on Long Island. Families winding down, porch lights flicking on, the kind of calm suburban night where the biggest disturbance might be a barking dog or the hum of a passing car. Inside her home, Kelly Coppola believed she was safe. Her daughter had homework spread out. Kenneth was upstairs, already drifting towards sleep. For Kelly, it was the sound of normalcy, the sound of life returning to something steady after years of upheaval. But just beyond those walls, another kind of night was forming. A night that had been planned, typed, and prepared like a blueprint brought to life. The daughter's phone buzzed. A text. Just 2 words, "Come outside." It wasn't unusual for Daniel to reach out, but the timing was strange. And the tone, it carried no warmth, no explanation. It was a command. At 15, she didn't pause to question it. She slipped out, past the glow of the living room lamp, and into the night air. Each step she took away from the house was a step towards something she couldn't yet imagine. Waiting at the curb was Daniel, the father she had always known, but not the man he had become. He sat in the car, engine idling, his face unreadable. The daughter slid into the passenger seat, expecting words, maybe a conversation. Instead, Daniel told her to wait. No details, no comfort, just wait. And beside him, resting within reach, was the weapon that would end 2 lives before the night was over. She stayed behind as instructed, her heart beating faster with every passing second. From the car window, the house looked as ordinary as ever, blinds drawn, porch light dim, a quiet suburban home. But the stillness masked what was about to unfold inside. Daniel stepped out of the car, his figure moved deliberately, each footfall heavier than the last. He walked toward the house that had once been his, the home where dinners were shared, where laughter had filled the halls, where his daughter had grown. But he wasn't walking toward memories, he was walking toward destruction. At the front door, he didn't hesitate, he didn't knock, he didn't speak. Instead, he lifted the gun. One squeeze of the trigger, and the night erupted. The lock shattered under the force of a bullet. Splinters of wood tore from the frame. The quiet street now echoed with violence. That door, once a symbol of separation, was gone, and with it, every last illusion of safety vanished. Inside the house, the sound ricocheted through the walls. Upstairs, Kelly and Kenneth stirred, their rest broken by the crack of a gunshot. But by then, it was too late. Daniel had already crossed the threshold. He was no longer the man outside looking in. He was inside, his weapon drawn, his plan unfolding second by second. From her seat in the car, the daughter had no idea what was happening. She couldn't see the broken door. She couldn't hear the footsteps climbing the stairs. All she knew was that she'd been told to wait, to sit still in the dark, while her father carried out something unspeakable just a few feet away. Later, investigators would say her father placed her there intentionally, not to protect her, but to keep her out of the way. And then in seconds, the home transformed. A place of comfort became a crime scene. The locks that once promised safety were gone. The air itself was heavy with danger. Upstairs, 2 lives were moments away from being stolen. And outside, a daughter sat silently, unaware that her entire world was about to collapse. The blueprint was no longer an idea, it was now in motion, and the house was no longer safe. The lock was gone, the door was broken, and Daniel Coppola was inside. The home that had once been his was now a stage for the violence he had planned so carefully. He moved quickly, climbing the staircase that led to the bedrooms above. Each step echoed like a countdown, closing the gap between thought and execution. Upstairs, Kelly and Kenneth were stirring, their sleep shattered by the crack of a gunshot at the door. But they had no time to act, no time to hide, no time to understand what was happening, because Daniel was already there. The first to face him was Kenneth Pohlman. He wasn't armed. He wasn't ready for a fight. Kenneth was a man who lived a simple life, a man whose greatest crime was falling in love with Kelly. But none of that mattered. Daniel raised the gun and pulled the trigger. The sound thundered through the house. A single moment, and Kenneth's life was gone. Kelly was next. For her, there was no escape. The man who once vowed to protect her was now the one ending her story. Another shot rang out, the kind of shot that silences not only a person, but every memory they carried, every hope they held, every future they dreamed of. In seconds, Kelly Coppola, mother, friend, daughter, was gone. And outside, in the car, sat a 15-year-old girl, waiting, watching the glow of her mother's home from the driveway, oblivious to the horror unfolding upstairs. She couldn't hear the gunshots, couldn't see the chaos, couldn't know that, within the walls she had once called home, both her mother and Kenneth lay dead. And here is the haunting truth. What does it do to a child's mind to know her father walked into her mother's home and ended her life? That knowledge, that scar, would not fade in days or weeks. It would follow her for a lifetime. The ambush was over in moments, but its impact, the destruction of a family, the betrayal of trust, the death of innocence, would stretch on forever. Most people won't finish this story, but if you do, you'll carry Kelly's memory. Subscribe, or one day these names will be forgotten like yesterday's news. The house on that quiet Long Island street had fallen silent. The gunshots were over, the ambush complete. Kelly and Kenneth were gone. And in the stillness that followed, Daniel Coppola walked out as though the destruction behind him was nothing more than another task checked off a list. He stepped back into the night where his daughter waited in the car, innocent, unaware, and about to be bound to the aftermath of his choices forever. He opened the driver's door, sat down, turned the key. The engine roared to life as if nothing unusual had happened. But in the passenger seat, a child sat with questions she couldn't yet form. Where had he gone? Why had he told her to wait? Why had there been that strange sound, loud, sharp, violent, that echoed through the night? None of it made sense. And Daniel didn't explain. He simply shifted the car into gear and drove away. Behind them, the house that once held laughter, arguments, memories, the house that had been Kelly's refuge, was no longer a home. It was a crime scene. And as the streetlights blurred past the windshield, Daniel carried with him not just his daughter, but the terrible weight of what he had just done. In his passenger seat sat the last living witness to his freedom. In his hands rested the power to decide what came next. The drive ended at his own home, a place that was supposed to be safe, but instead became the second stage of the nightmare. He brought his daughter inside. For her, the confusion was turning into dread. She had left her mother's home alive. She had left her mother behind. And now she was here, forced into the silence of her father's house. What came next, she could not predict, because Daniel began to unravel. The cold calculation that carried him through the ambush gave way to something darker, despair. He spoke of ending his own life. He told his daughter he was going to pull the trigger on himself. Imagine being 15 years old and hearing those words from your father, a man who had just taken away your mother, now threatening to take away himself. For a child, it was a weight too heavy to bear. But it was real, and it was unfolding right in front of her. In that moment, she faced a choice no teenager should ever face: stay silent and watch the only parent left alive self-destruct, or speak up, risk everything, and call for help. Her hands trembled, her heart pounded, but she chose courage. She picked up the phone. She dialed 911. On the recording, her voice carried the unmistakable tone of a child forced to grow up in an instant. She told dispatchers what no child should ever have to say: her father had killed her mother. The weight of that sentence traveled through the phone lines, through the dispatcher's headset, and into the hearts of every officer who was sent racing toward Daniel's home. Police arrived quickly. Sirens split the night air, red and blue lights flashing against the windows of a house now gripped by tragedy. Officers entered cautiously. They knew what they had been told. They knew what might be waiting, and what they found confirmed the horror. Inside was Daniel Coppola. The gun was there, the daughter was there, and so was the heavy silence of two lives lost only minutes before. But the silence didn't last. Body cameras rolled as officers confronted Daniel. And in that raw, unfiltered footage, prosecutors say the truth spilled out. No court script, no polished testimony, just the words of a man caught in the moment, his own voice tying him to the crime. A confession, captured on tape, that would follow him from that night all the way into the courtroom. The blueprint for murder was no longer hidden on a piece of paper in his home. It was now written in actions. It was written in blood. And now, with body cameras rolling, it was written in his own words. When police searched Daniel Coppola's home, they expected bitterness. Maybe a journal filled with angry thoughts. Maybe letters never sent. The kind of artifacts investigators often find in domestic disputes turned violent. But what they discovered was not impulsive, not messy. It was typed, neat, deliberate. A document that prosecutors would later call a chilling roadmap to murder. At first glance, it seemed unthinkable. A typed plan, carefully constructed, outlining violence step by step. But the deeper investigators read, the more horrifying it became. Kelly Coppola's name appeared, Kenneth's too. The targets were obvious: his ex-wife, the man who loved her. But then the blueprint widened. Attorneys who had represented Kelly, lawyers tied to the divorce proceedings, even, shockingly, his own attorney. It was a list that read less like notes from a heartbroken man and more like an execution order from someone who saw the world as his enemy. Think about that for a moment. Divorce lawyers, people who handled hundreds of cases, who had simply done their jobs, now appeared on a list that spelled out death. Men and women who had walked out of a courtroom filing papers, never imagining that somewhere in Daniel's home, their names were being cataloged in a blueprint for violence. It wasn't just shocking, it was chilling in its reach. This discovery forced prosecutors to confront a grim truth. This wasn't rage boiling over one night. This wasn't about an argument that escalated. This was a man who sat down, opened a document, and began typing his plan, letter by letter, line by line, calculating, revising, preparing. A blueprint not of construction, but of destruction. The word blueprint matters, because blueprints are not accidents. They are plans. They are instructions designed to be followed. Architects create blueprints when they want to build. Daniel created his when he wanted to destroy. And in those pages was the terrifying evidence that every step he took, from texting his daughter to bringing the gun to walking through the door, had already been rehearsed in ink long before that night. It is one thing to kill in a fit of rage. It is another to design a plan with names, details, and intent. This wasn't grief. This wasn't heartbreak. This was preparation. Cold, deliberate, methodical. For investigators, holding that document was like holding the crime before it happened. Every sentence, every word confirmed what they already suspected, that Daniel Coppola hadn't simply snapped. He had mapped out murder like a man drafting a project. And when the night of August 28th came, he wasn't improvising. He was executing. To the public, this detail was the most disturbing of all. It meant that Kelly's death wasn't just the tragic end of a broken marriage. It was the fulfillment of a plan that might have gone even further if it had not ended that night. Attorneys, associates, names that had nothing to do with family life were listed in the very same blueprint. The scale was chilling. The reach was broader than anyone first imagined. And it forced everyone who saw the document to ask, how far would he have gone? How many names would have been crossed off if he hadn't been stopped? The blueprint wasn't just paper. It was proof. Proof of intent. Proof of planning. Proof of a mind that sat alone and mapped out murder. It turned Daniel Coppola from an angry ex-husband into something else entirely, a calculated predator. A man who built his crime with the same precision others used to build a home, a business, a future. Except his construction ended with death. This is why prosecutors leaned on the document so heavily. Because it stripped away the excuses. It dismantled any claim that this was sudden, emotional, or accidental. And in its place, it revealed the truth, that every life taken on August 28th was planned for. That this crime was not born in the heat of a single moment, but in the cold preparation of many nights spent typing alone in silence. Her story isn't on Netflix, it's here. And it only survives if you keep it alive. Subscribe now, or explain in the comments why her death doesn't deserve your voice. When the grand jury finished its work, the charges were clear. Daniel Coppola would face indictment on 4 counts of murder, not 2, 4. Prosecutors wanted to send a message. This was not just a family tragedy. This was an act of cold, calculated violence that shook the very foundation of Long Island's sense of safety. The day of his arraignment, the courtroom filled early. Rows of wooden benches creaked under the weight of families, reporters, neighbors. The judge's bench towered above, a reminder that the next chapter of this story would not be written in anger, but in law. Deputies led Daniel in through a side door, shackles on his wrists, shackles on his ankles. He kept his eyes down, his face unreadable. He was no longer the man in control. He was the accused, and the blueprint that prosecutors claimed to hold in their hands was now his undoing. When asked for his plea, Daniel raised his head, spoke 2 words, "Not guilty." The silence that followed was heavy. Not guilty? Families in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, some shaking their heads, others biting back tears. To them, those words felt like denial layered on top of devastation. They had buried Kelly. They had buried Kenneth. They had seen the evidence of the shattered door, the blood, the typed blueprint. And now the man accused of tearing their lives apart stood before a judge and said he was not guilty. Prosecutors wasted no time in response. They told the court they would seek the harshest penalty available under New York law, life in prison without parole. No chance of release. No opportunity for redemption. For them, this case was not just about punishment, it was about protection. If Daniel had already targeted his ex-wife, her partner, and even attorneys, who could say he would have stopped if he had ever walked free again? Inside the courtroom, grief hung in the air. Kelly's family sat shoulder to shoulder, hands clasped tight, as if holding on to one another was the only way to keep from falling apart. Her mother dabbed her eyes with a tissue, whispering prayers no one could hear. Kenneth's relatives sat stone-faced, jaws clenched, anger mixing with heartbreak. To lose him in such a brutal way felt incomprehensible. And then there was the daughter, 15 years old, forced to sit in the same room as the father accused of destroying her world. She was no longer just a witness to a crime, she was a survivor of it. Reporters filled every available seat, pens scribbling, cameras waiting outside for the smallest glimpse. And beyond the courthouse walls, the community of St. James tried to make sense of what had happened in their quiet town. This wasn't New York City crime. This wasn't organized violence or a random act by a stranger. This was one of their own, a neighbor, a father, a man who had lived among them, now accused of plotting murder on a scale so cold and deliberate that the press had already given it a name, the Blueprint Murder. In coffee shops, people spoke in hushed tones. Parents reassured their children that they were safe, even as they themselves felt less sure. At school, teenagers whispered about the daughter, what she had seen, what she had survived. Teachers struggled to explain. And for many, the most unsettling part wasn't just that 2 lives had been taken. It was that it had all been planned, designed, written out like instructions to follow. If it could happen in St. James, it could happen anywhere, and that realization left a chill that would linger long after the courtroom emptied each day. The courtroom was about law, indictments, pleas, evidence, but the gallery was about grief, about a community that had lost more than 2 people. They had lost the illusion of safety. They had lost the idea that their quiet streets were immune from the horrors they saw on the evening news. And now, they carried a new identity, the town where the Blueprint murder happened. A mother, a boyfriend, a daughter caught in the crossfire of hate, and a blueprint that read less like notes on paper and more like a death warrant. That's what this case leaves behind. Not only 2 lives stolen, but the reminder that evil can be planned, rehearsed, and executed with the coldness of someone following instructions on a page. Kelly Coppola wasn't just a victim. She was a woman in her 50s who had fought through the hardest years of her life and finally found light again. She was a mother who wanted her daughter to grow up in a home filled with love, not bitterness. She was a friend who laughed loudly, loved deeply, and believed she still had a future to write. That future was ripped away before she could finish the story she was building. And Kenneth Pohlman Jr. wasn't just the boyfriend. He was a man who lived a quiet life, a steady life. He wasn't a headline chaser. He wasn't someone who wanted the spotlight. He wanted peace. He wanted companionship. He wanted to stand beside Kelly in this new chapter of her life. And for that, he paid with his life. His only crime was being there for the woman he loved. Then there's the daughter, 15 years old, too young to carry the kind of scars she will now live with forever. Imagine being told by your father to leave the house to sit in the car while inside, your mother and her partner upstairs, fast asleep. Imagine waiting in silence, not knowing that within minutes, everything you loved was being taken from you. And then imagine the moment you learned the truth, that it was your father who destroyed your mother's life. That kind of wound doesn't heal, it lingers. It shapes every day that follows. The story isn't just about murder, it's about control, about the darkness of jealousy, about what happens when resentment hardens into obsession. Daniel Coppola didn't just lose his marriage, he lost his sense of power. And instead of facing it, he chose to write a plan, a blueprint, that turned human lives into names on a list. Names to be crossed out, lives to be ended. That document turned a man into something else, an architect of destruction. And in following it, he destroyed not just 2 lives, but the trust of a daughter who will never see her family the same way again. As we close, I want you to look closely at their faces. Kelly's smile, captured forever in a family photo. Kenneth's calm, steady expression. They are more than victims. They were people with histories, with laughter, with futures, people who were loved, people who mattered, and now they live only in memory. Their voices silenced by a man who believed he could control life and death with the stroke of a key and the pull of a trigger. And the question remains, one that prosecutors, neighbors, and even his own family may never answer. If there was a blueprint for this murder, what was the plan for after? What did Daniel see in his mind beyond that night? Or was there never supposed to be an after? Was the blueprint designed only to end, leaving nothing but ruin in its wake? Kelly can't ask you to remember her. Kenneth can't ask you to keep his name alive, but I can. Subscribe now, or step into the comments and tell the world why you'd rather let them fade into silence.